Welcome to LanceMed Academy, and in today's video we'll be talking about the nervous system development. So 3 weeks after conception, which is the fusion of the spermatozoa and the egg cell, we have conception. And so 3 weeks after this conception, there is a flat cell in the top layer of the embryo, which is known as the ectoderm, which forms into a tube which gives rise to every part of the nervous system, and this is called the ectoderm. So this flat layer is known as the ectoderm. So 3 weeks after conception, the ectoderm begins to swell at the center, and when it begins to swell, it gives rise to what is called the neural plate. So here you have the neural plate at the 3rd week after conception, even before the lady knows she's pregnant. So you have the neural plate. Now when this neural plate swells, the edges around the neural plate begins to elevate and fold upward. So that is where we have this step. So this is known as what? The neural fold. And when it begins to fold and elevate upward, then around the 22nd to the 23rd day of the pregnancy, this fold actually meets at a midline, and it joins from middle and it zips up and zips down. And then when it folds, this is actually called your neural tube. Your neural tube. And this neural tube is where everything begins from. And if you take a closer look at the neural tube in the next place, you will see that this attaching cells and parts of the tube is actually deflecting away from the tube. And these deflecting parts are actually known as the neural crest cells. So we call this the neural crest cells. And these neural crest cells are what gives rise to the peripheral nervous system. So it gives rise also to your dorsal root ganglion, to your autonomic ganglia, and it also gives rise to your Schwann cells and most parts of the peripheral nervous system. And it gives rise generally to the peripheral nervous system. So I would put here that the neural crest cells, they deflect to give rise to the what? To the peripheral nervous system. So your peripheral nervous system is made from the neural crest cells. Now we have our neural tube in this stage, and this, like I said, is the what? 22nd to the 23rd day of the pregnancy. So when you have your neural tube standing alone after the neural crest cells have deflected to go and give the peripheral nervous system the dorsal root ganglia and the autonomic ganglia with your Schwann cells, this tube has two parts. We have the cranial parts and the caudal parts. So the cranial parts of the neural tube after 4 weeks of conception will begin to swell, and it will swell and give rise to 3 vesicles, also known as what? Chambers. And these 3 chambers are actually the formation of the brain. So you can actually label this part as your word brain development. And the first chamber here, we will have this is 4 weeks after conception. And the first chamber here, we will have the prosencephalon. And the second chamber is the mesencephalon. The third chamber it gives rise to is what? The rhombencephalon. And mind you, the neural tube also has what? A lumen, and I'll come back to this. So at exactly 4 weeks after conception, the neural tube, the cranial part swells to give the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. At the 5th week after conception, these 3 divisions will further expand to give us what? 5 chambers. So we'll have 5 chambers in total. The prosencephalon will divide into 2, the mesencephalon will remain the same, and the rhombencephalon will divide into 2. So 2 plus 1 plus 2, we have what? 5 chambers. And what would these 5 chambers be? So like I said, this part would be the telencephalon, and the second chamber is the diencephalon. The third part would remain the mesencephalon. The fourth part we have is the mesencephalon, and the last part we have here is the melencephalon. The melencephalon. For easy memory, I said these two parts is a part of the prosencephalon. So it's a derivative of the prosencephalon. And I said this remains what? The mesencephalon. And these two parts is a derivative of the rhombencephalon. So I'll just put this, the rhombencephalon. So remember, at week 4, we have the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. And at week 5, the prosencephalon would give rise to the telencephalon and the diencephalon. And the mesencephalon would remain the same. And the rhombencephalon would give rise to the metencephalon and the melencephalon. Now, this telencephalon is what would divide to give what? The cerebral hemispheres and the basal ganglia. The diencephalon would give rise to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The mesencephalon would give rise to the midbrain. The metencephalon would give rise to the pons and the cerebellum. The myencephalon would give rise to the medulla oblongata. So this is what will happen at exactly week 5 after conception. So this is week 5 after conception. So this is how the brain actually develops from the neural tube. First, the cranial parts will develop into the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. And at week 5, this prosencephalon will give rise to the telencephalon. And this is where the cerebral hemisphere and the basal ganglia is formed from. It divides into the structures. The diencephalon will divide into the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The mesencephalon would remain without dividing, and it gives rise to the midbrain. The metencephalon and the myelencephalon would be formed from the rhombencephalon, and it gives rise to the pons and cerebellum. And finally, we'll have the myencephalon, which is also derived from the rhombencephalon, and it will give rise to the medulla oblongata. I hope this is clear for the brain development. So this is exactly the stages of the brain development we have. And next we will move to the development of the spinal cord. Now I told you that the spinal cord forms from the caudal part of the neural tube. So during the 5th week after conception, the caudal part of the neural tube fragments into 3 layers. We have the ventricular layer, we have the intermediate layer, and we have the marginal layer. Now, the ventricular layer would give rise to the neuroblast and the glioblast cells. And these cells will begin to move up and out of this layer. And the neuroblast cell will actually settle at the middle layer or the intermediate layer. And when it settles at this layer, it begins to divide into the neuron. And when it divides into the neuron, it will actually form the gray matter of this neuron. So this intermediate layer, the neuroblast will settle down here, mature and divide. And when it divides, it gives rise to the neuron, which is the gray matter. And this is what we see here, which is your what? Gray matter, labeled blue and red. It will give rise to the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now, this marginal layer would actually develop and form the axons of the neuron that is being produced at the intermediate layer. And this would be the white matter of the spinal cord. So here we have the gray matter of the spinal cord. So permit me to just label this as the gray matter. And here we would have the white matter. And I told you that the intermediate layer would give rise to this gray matter and would give rise to the white matter. And now when you get to this point, the gray matter would divide into two plates. We have the alar plate and the basal plate. The alar plate known as the dorsal plate and the basal plate known as the ventral plate. So here you would have the alar plate and the basal plate. And in between the alar plates and the basal plate, there is something separating. There is a sulcus separating the two plates. And this is known as the sulcus limitans. This is because the alar plate, which is known as the dorsal horn, is responsible for receiving sensory information. And the basal plate, which is known as the ventral horn, is responsible for receiving motor information. So this is why you need the sulcus limitans, so that the information will not mix and the layers will be perfectly separated. The alar plate, known as the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, sensory information or sensory impulses. The basal plate, known as the ventral horn, is responsible for motor impulses. And then you have the sulcus limitans. And here you have the roof, and here you have the floor. So the next thing, or the next part of the spinal cord that forms actually, is what is known as the lateral horn of the spinal cord. And this is between the alar plate or the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. And this is known as the lateral horn. This lateral horn actually, it contains preganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system. The lateral horn actually has different neurons for the autonomic nervous system at different levels of the spinal cord. So from T1 to the L2 level, we will have the sympathetic neurons. And in the S2 to the S4 segment, we will have the parasympathetic neurons. So, like I explained, at the 5th week, you have the division into the various layers, the ventricular layer, intermediate layer, and marginal layer. The ventricular layer would give rise to the neuroblast and glioblast cells, which begins to deviate outward. And in the intermediate layer, the neuroblast cell settles and begins to form the neuron. And this forms what? The gray matter of the neuron, while the marginal layer forms the axons of this neuron. And I said the gray matter would give rise to the alar plate or the dorsal horn responsible for sensory impulses, and the basal plate or the ventral horn responsible for motor responses. And the next thing I said, the lateral horn forms, which is different at different levels of the spinal cord, and the T1 to L2 segment produces the sympathetic neurons, and the S2 to S4 segment produces the parasympathetic neurons at the 5th week after conception, so week 5. So this is week 5. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is actually the ventricular system. And the ventricular system is actually the channels that are able to produce and circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. And here we have the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct, and the central canal, which I will talk more on in subsequent videos. So the lateral ventricle is formed from the lumen of the telencephalon. So here we have what? The lateral ventricle. And this is formed from the lumen of the telencephalon. So there's a lumen here. Like I told you, the neural tube has what? A lumen. This also, the lateral ventricle will be formed from the lumen of the telencephalon. The third ventricle will be formed from the lumen of the diencephalon. So at the diencephalon we would have the third ventricle. The next thing we have is the cerebral aqueduct, and it will be formed from the lumen of the mesencephalon. So here you would have your cerebral aqueduct. And the next we have is the fourth ventricle, and it is formed from the lumen of the metencephalon. So I will just put this here. So here we have, let me put this color. Here we have the fourth ventricle. And lastly, we have the central canal. And the central canal is formed at the lumen of the spinal cord. So we have the central canal. So these are the what? Systems responsible for the production and circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. We have the lateral ventricle formed from the lumen of the telencephalon, the third ventricle from the lumen of the diencephalon, the cerebral aqueduct from the lumen of the mesencephalon, the fourth ventricle from the lumen of the metencephalon, and the central canal from the lumen of the spinal cord. Thank you guys for making it thus far to the end of this video for the development of the nervous system. If you want free PDFs and highly illustrated diagrams, visit our website at www.landsmedacademy and get your free PDFs and diagrams. Until next time, see you guys.